I've read Richard's books, but I never met him until this evening. He reminded me of something that someone said to me the other day at the petrol station in Exeter, Tasmania. He said, you know, he said, almost all the really nice Americans are already living in Tasmania. That's the backhanded compliment. Richard is one of those Americans who sort of goes naked as a human being. So you see what you see is what you get. He would be accepted here, he would be loved here, and I think he'd love the life here. He's been out trying to warn and inform the world of a crisis which is now upon us. And finally, people are beginning to pay attention to it. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Richard.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's a pleasure and honor to be invited to participate in the Richard Jones lecture, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Hobart. I'm going to be talking about two things. First of all, the problem of oil depletion, peak oil, and second, a policy that I believe could help tremendously in our societal adaptation to a future with shrinking oil supplies and soaring prices. But first of all, I'm just curious, how many folks here have heard the term peak oil before but don't really know very much about what it actually is? Okay, that's a fair number. Don't be shy. How many folks have tried to explain peak oil to a friend or relative? Oh, interesting. How many here have actually written something about peak oil? Letter to the editor, essay, something? Quite a few. Interesting. How many of you spend an hour or more a day on the internet reading news articles about not too many? Oh, a few there. Okay, well, the first part of my talk will hopefully be useful to those of you who don't know that much about what peak oil is, and for those of you who already spend an hour or so a day reading about it, maybe it will give you a little more ammunition to use in your own efforts to speak to political leaders and so on. Oil, as we have used it over the last 150 years, has been primarily an energy source. Of course, it's lots of other things, but we've used it primarily as an energy source, and we humans are energy junkies, always have been, always will be. Because energy is what makes things happen. Without energy, it's a pretty dull universe. We humans have used energy from the environment in the form of food forever, and we've exerted energy or force into our environments by way of muscle power. But we've also managed to use our big, clever brains to figure out ways of harvesting more energy from our environments and applying energy within our environments, and those methods included harnessing fire, developing agriculture, domesticating animals, and then hooking them up to plows and carts and chariots and so on. Then we developed water mills and windmills and sails along the way, of course. And all of these things incrementally added to our energy harvest. And of course, it takes energy to get energy, so every one of these things required an energy investment. But every one of them delivered, at least in good years, enough of a net energy profit so as to enable the construction of larger and more complex societies. We couldn't have built civilizations without agriculture. And so what's happened over the last 200 years is that we found a source of energy that humans had never really tapped before, namely fossil fuels. And then we went about inventing all kinds of machines to use the energy from fossil fuels. Most of us, I think, tend to think of the Industrial Revolution as having been mostly about inventing new gadgets. But of course, if we hadn't had the fossil fuels, we wouldn't have been able to invent most of those gadgets, because we had this amazing cheap energy source. So it was natural to find ways of using that cheap energy to transport ourselves around ever more quickly and do all kinds of things that we used to do with muscle power. Now we even have electric toothbrushes. So fossil fuels were like winning the energy lottery, and they've changed everything about our way of life. One way of gauging this is just how our own population has grown over the last 200 years. Now, we've used fossil fuels to expand the human carrying capacity of planet Earth. We've done that in a number of ways, one of which is obviously just by growing more food, using fossil fuels to pump water for irrigation, to make artificial fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, to run plows and tractors to clear forests. And then, once we have the food, we use fossil fuels to transport it from where it's abundant to where it's scarce, so that we can keep large populations alive in places that otherwise would be devoid of people, places like Phoenix, Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada. How many people could live there without fossil fuels? Probably not very many. So that has enabled an enormous expansion of the human population from 1 billion in 1820 to 2 billion in 1930 to 3 billion in the 1960s, 4 billion in the late 70s, 5 billion in the late 80s, 6 billion by the late 90s, and now we've added another half billion just since 1999. Now, we ecologists look at this graph and we see what we call a population bloom. And of course, there are many other examples from nature of population blooms. Where I come from, in Northern California, in Sonoma County, wine country, we're very familiar with this pattern of population bloom. Adding a bit of yeast to a vat of grape juice, the yeast proliferate very quickly. They experience a population bloom, and in the process, they eat the energy source of their environment, the sugar. So at the same time, they're also giving off a waste product, alcohol, which of course is kind of the point of the exercise as far as we're concerned. And that waste product is poisonous to the yeast. So they're consuming their energy, their resource base, and they're also poisoning themselves with their waste products. Sort of like what we're doing with fossil fuels, isn't it? We're using up the fossil fuels as quickly as we can, and meanwhile, as we burn them, we give off a waste product in the environment, namely carbon dioxide, that's kind of poisoning the world's climate. Which to me brings up a very important question. Now, it's a facetious question, I grant you, but in a way, I think it's a very serious one, because this is the question we will be answering over the course of this century, over the course of our lifetimes. And we pride ourselves as humans on being very clever and intelligent, but I would suggest that the one measure of intelligence that would really mean anything in this context is the ability to see and foresee the consequences of our actions and understand when those actions are harmful to our future existence, and then change our behavior accordingly. That's a pretty good measure of intelligence, I think. So how does peak oil relate to all of this? Well, peak oil is essentially an observation of what happens as we deplete oil reserves. Now, this happens in individual oil fields, and these are diagrams of the production profiles of 4 oil fields. The 2 on the top are Russian fields. On the bottom left is a Texas oil field. On the bottom right is Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. And obviously, these production profiles are different. Some The Texas one has two separate peaks, for example. But if you take lots of production profiles from individual oil fields and add them together in a large contiguous region, the overall profile tends to resemble a kind of bell-shaped curve. And that's really part of the essence of peak oil. The notion that extraction of oil doesn't start low, reach a plateau, and then go on until all the oil is gone and then drop off suddenly at the end. It tails off for about half of the production process. So we've seen this happen not just in individual oil fields, but in oil-producing countries, most notably the United States, which used to be the world's foremost oil producer. Now, my young students at New College in California are sometimes shocked to hear this, because for as long as they've been alive, the U.S. has been a major oil importer. And I have to remind them of an old TV show that they maybe have seen reruns of, the Beverly Hillbillies, to get an idea of what the U.S. used to be like. You know, the Clampett family goes out, Jed Clampett goes out shooting for some food, and up from the ground comes bubbling crude. Well, that's a story that, well, not exactly that story, but things like that used to happen in the U.S. They don't happen anymore, because discovery of oil in the lower 48 U.S. reached a peak in 1930 and has been declining ever since, and it's practically nil today. Meanwhile, production of oil, or extraction of oil in the lower 48, reached a peak in 1970, and it's been in decline ever since then. So if the Clampett family were around today and somebody tried to make a similar TV show, they'd have to be living in Kazakhstan or someplace like that. It wouldn't make any sense for them to be in the U.S. So this U.S. oil production peak was an extremely important historic event. Modern American history kind of revolves around that, because prior to that time, the U.S. had been even an oil exporter during the early part of the 20th century. It obtained enormous wealth from its position as the epicenter of global petroleum industry. And then after U.S. oil production peaked, we had the oil shocks of the 70s. The U.S. realized how vulnerable it was to disruptions in supply. Then in 1979, we had the Carter Doctrine, which said that the U.S. would use its military force to defend its access to the oil supplies of the Middle East. So the American economy has changed from being an economy based on loaning money to the rest of the world to being one that is borrowing $2 billion a day just to finance the trade deficit. 40% of that borrowing goes to pay for oil. And U.S. foreign policy has changed because of this. So peak oil is not just something theoretical that might happen in the future. It's something that's been happening for some time. Now, after the U.S. peaked, other countries started doing the same thing. I guess it was sort of a fad. No, I don't know. The next country to do so, or no, somewhere down the line comes the North Sea, actually. In the 1970s, discoveries in the North Sea were very good news for the world, because this was light sweet crude that was not in the Middle East, so we went about extracting that crude with all the latest technology, doing it as efficiently as possible, with the consequence that extraction peaked only 30 years after peak of discovery. And we've seen peaks in now, at this point, most of the world's oil-producing nations. Most of the world's oil producers are in steady decline. So it stands to reason that global production will peak at some point. Now, when? Well, let's look at global oil discoveries. Have they reached a maximum? Are they in decline? Absolutely. Global oil discoveries peaked around 1964, so that's more than 40 years ago. And these days, in a typical year, 2004, 2005, we're finding something like 5 or 6 billion barrels of oil. And meanwhile, using about 30 billion barrels. So the ratio of what we find to what we're using is about 1 to 5 or 1 to 6. This is a graph of what it may look like when all is said and done. This shows the history, the early days, as we became more and more dependent on oil, the oil shocks of 73 and 79. And as a result of those oil shocks, many governments around the world instituted efficiency measures. In the US, that included lowering speed limits from 75 to 55 miles an hour on interstate highways, mandating the production of more fuel-efficient cars. And then people just spontaneously changed their habits. They started buying smaller cars and insulating their houses better and so on. And that had an effect. For several years, we actually used less oil. And then when prices went back down in the mid-80s, of course, most of those efficiency measures fell by the wayside, and we've gotten that much more dependent on oil since then. This is another representation of how things may be going. The blue is global oil discoveries so far, and then projected discoveries based on the existing trend. Green is global oil production, and likely future production if current trends continue. And the red is global oil demand, and where global oil demand would like to go in the future. And every responsible agency, the International Energy Agency, the US Department of Energy, and so on, all project global oil demand to increase substantially in the next 2 or 3 decades. And that's the problem with peak oil, because demand would like to increase and supply is probably not going to do so. Hence the rub. Now, the International Energy Agency was set up in the 1970s by the OECD countries, the wealthy countries of the world, to warn of future oil shocks. And generally, the IEA has been very optimistic about future oil supply. But there are a few dissidents within the organization, including the author of a PowerPoint show from which this slide was taken, Klaus Rehag, who is no longer with the IEA. He was warning of a supply crunch, a coming oil shock. And he was doing so just as the prices were starting to shoot up a couple of years ago. And some things he points out in this slide are very interesting and important. He says older fields are mature and declining. That's important because not all oil fields are the same. Some are giant or supergiant fields, and some are very small. About half of current world oil production comes from only about 120 supergiant fields that were all discovered in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and maybe a couple of them since then. So these are old, mature oil fields that are going into decline, fields like Cantarell in the Gulf of Mexico, and Burgan in Kuwait, and so on. The other half of world oil production comes from thousands of much smaller oil fields, and those are the kinds of fields that are being discovered these days. So we have to find and develop lots of these small new oil fields to make up for the declines in the giants and supergiants as they reach their maturity. Then he also points out that global oil reserves have been overstated for political reasons. Now, there's a bit of interesting history to this. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, really has just one job, and that is to constrain production so as to keep prices up. The problem with oil from the beginning of the industry, almost up to the present, has been too much of the stuff. And so we've had Standard Oil, the Texas Railroad Commission, and OPEC at various points in oil history, whose purpose has been to keep production down so that prices wouldn't fall so low that the producers would go out of business. So the way OPEC did this was in the early 80s, it tied production from member states to reserves. So if your reserves were higher, you could produce more oil and sell it to the world market. Well, this, of course, created an incentive for member nations to overstate their reserves. Did they do so? Well, let's look. 1985, Kuwait is the first on the scene. It goes from 63.9 billion barrels of reserves to 90 billion barrels. Not a trivial increase. No significant discoveries in Kuwait that year. Abu Dhabi, 2 years later, goes from 31 billion barrels to 92.2. The same year, Iran from 48.8 to 92.9, and Iraq, just next door to Iran, not wanting to be outdone by its neighbor, goes from 47.1 to a nice round 100 billion barrels of reserves. Now, all of this looks a bit suspicious on its own, but then you look at where the reserves go from there, and they just basically stay exactly the same from year to year, even though presumably these countries are actually extracting some of that oil and selling it. And then a couple of years later, Saudi Arabia goes from 170 to 257.5 billion barrels. Now, when these numbers are batted around in the media, they're always followed by two words: proven reserves. Now, those words actually have a technical meaning within the industry, but for the average layperson, I think it's inevitable that the assumption is made that there must be some independent agency that proves the existence of these reserves, some international oil cop with a giant dipstick who goes around checking to see if Saudi Arabia really has 260 billion barrels. And of course, there is no such agency. These figures are self-reported, and the actual oil reserves of each and every one of these countries is a state secret. So we're sort of flying blind as far as world oil reserves are concerned. Now, this is an important point, because when the subject of peak oil comes up, there are the near peakers and the far peakers. Everyone agrees that global oil production will peak, but some say that we're just about there right now, and some say, no, don't worry, not a problem. It's 2 or 3 decades away, and by that time, of course, we'll all be driving hydrogen cars, and it won't make any difference. Now, on what basis is the assertion made that production won't peak for some time? Well, a large part of that basis is discussion about global reserves and how global reserves are so enormous. Now, in fact, global reserves, the reserves figures have been manipulated in various ways, but in a sense it doesn't matter that much, because reserves figures are not a good predictor of oil production peaks. We know that because that's been the case with individual nations that have peaked. Starting with the United States. In 1970, U.S. oil reserves were higher than they had ever been. In 1970, U.S. oil production was higher than it had ever been in any previous year. And that was the year U.S. oil production peaked. So the argument that we can't be close to peak because world oil reserves are so high, they're higher than they've ever been, is rather hollow. We have to look to other things like discovery rates, decline rates from existing fields, in order to get a better view of when the global oil production peak is likely to occur. An important piece of data is how we're doing with new production capacity as it's able to offset declines from existing fields. Now, currently, the world production capacity is hovering right around 85 million barrels per day. Yeah, let that number sink in. Now, we need new production capacity every year for 2 reasons. First of all, to meet new demand, because new demand is coming from countries like China and India. We need about 1.5 million barrels a day of new production capacity to meet that new demand. But then, there are many countries, as I've already said, whose production is in decline, so some other countries have to produce more on a yearly basis than they did in previous years in order to offset those declines. And that adds up to about 4 million barrels a day of new production capacity needed. So a total of about 6 million barrels a day. That's a big job. We have to do the same thing in 2007 and 2008. This is cumulative over time, so that by 2009, the world will have had to have found and developed more new oil production capacity than currently exists as total production capacity in Saudi Arabia and Russia, the world's 2 largest producers. That's just by 2009. That's an enormous job, obviously. Now, of course, it's not impossible in principle, because the industry's been doing that with every passing year. However, the job gets harder with every passing year, and it's like a treadmill. The oil industry is on a kind of treadmill. The treadmill is speeding up, and the runner is tiring. So that, again, is very close to the essence of the debate about global oil production peak. Now, inevitably the question comes up, okay, when do you think it's going to happen? And I have to defer to people who I believe are the real experts in this regard, people like Colin Campbell, the British petroleum geologist, whom I regard as my mentor in this field, and also Chris Skrabowski, a colleague who edits Petroleum Review in London. Chris has spent his entire life in the oil industry. He heard about peak oil from Colin Campbell in 1995, and Chris then set out to disprove peak oil. He thought this could not be the case, can't be true. So he assembled all the data and crunched it himself repeatedly, and came to the conclusion that things were looking a bit dicey. So he has been publishing an ongoing study called Oil Field Mega Projects, in which he looks at all of the new production capacity coming online, and also looks at the declines from existing fields on a field-by-field basis. It's a lot of data. And he was recently asked the same question, when do you think peak will happen? And he said this: at the moment, roughly 28% of world production is coming from countries in outright decline and going down at roughly 5% a year. By 2010, this will rise to 40% of world production. There's the possibility that things could deteriorate much more quickly. My latest calculations show the world will develop 18.8 million barrels a day of new capacity in the 2006 to 2010 period. Depletion will offset 9.5 million barrels a day of this over the same period. This means if all goes fully according to plan, there will be 9.3 million barrels a day of new capacity, or just over 1.8 each year to meet new demand. So up to 2010, we can probably muddle through with high prices and restrained demand. Faster depletion and project delays would obviously make the situation worse. After 2010, however, the situation deteriorates rapidly with negative supply growth in 2011 and 12. We don't have any reliable data beyond 2012, but all the indications are that the situation would be getting worse quite quickly. And then when he was pressed on the point, are we really going to get there? He said, I feel it's my duty, given the social and economic chaos peak oil will undoubtedly produce, to stick very closely to defensible assumptions. If you ask me, do I personally think we'll make it to 2010, my answer is probably not. Random factors in Murphy's Law more or less rule out everything running smoothly. This, however, is not analysis, but gut feel and hunch. On the hunch basis, 2008 would probably be my answer, but 2010, my analysis. So I believe you're not going to get any better answer to the question anywhere than that. Where are we exactly? Well, this is simply a representation of what recent oil production figures have been. And you'll notice we're pretty much stalled out at between 84 and 85 million barrels a day for the last 18 months or so. This is suggestive. No one knows for sure if the world is actually at peak right now. I would say it's very likely we're within the peaking period. In other words, we may see some incremental gains in production, but overall they won't be enough to significantly affect prices. And in effect, we are at the top of that broad Hubbard curve effectively now. Now, as I've said, there is some controversy over this, and some of the folks who are far peakers are very prominent in the world. They are heads of agencies like the U.S. Department of Energy or U.S. Geological Survey, and big consulting firms like Cambridge Energy Research Associates. And so their pronouncement is kind of the received wisdom that most of the rest of the business world takes its cue from. And up to, I would say, the last year, the idea of a near-term oil production peak globally was a kind of fringe idea. It's not anymore. Chevron, one of the world's foremost oil companies, has been taking out ads pointing out that oil production is in decline in most of the oil-producing countries. It's telling us that end of cheap oil is at hand. Russia's energy minister said just the same thing. We can say with certainty that the era of cheap hydrocarbons is over. The chief economist of the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, Zhang Weiping, recently said that he expects global oil production to peak during the next 5 years. By the way, this last little statement here is kind of delicious. He says, high oil prices will have adverse effects on China's economy. Yes. Meanwhile, Business Week tells us that the oil companies are at peak production. They don't control the majority of the world's oil reserves, but nevertheless, it's significant that the companies themselves are at peak. And then everybody's favorite petroleum geologist, Bill Clinton, says effectively the same thing. And finally, the New York Times recently ran an editorial online saying, quote, the concept of peak oil has not been widely written about, but people are talking about it now. It deserves a careful look, largely because it is almost certainly correct. Thank you, New York Times. Now, how bad a problem is this? This is a question that was taken up by a research team about 2 years ago, impaneled by the U.S. Department of Energy. The Department of Energy asked two questions. Is global oil production really something we should be worried about? And if so, what should we do? And the team came back with a 100-page report called Peaking of World Oil Production, Impacts, Mitigation, and Risk Management. They published it in February 2005, but the U.S. Department of Energy effectively buried it. For months, this report was only available on the website of a high school in Chula Vista, California. It's now widely available on the internet, and I urge you actually to look it up and read it because it's an extraordinary report. It's of historic importance. Let me read you the executive summary. This is actually just the first page of the first paragraph, of the executive summary, which is about 3 pages long. It says, the peaking of world oil production presents the U.S. and the world with an unprecedented risk management problem. As peaking is approached, liquid fuel prices and price volatility will increase dramatically, and without timely mitigation, the economic, social, and political costs will be unprecedented. So when they use this word unprecedented, which you may note they've used twice in this first paragraph, they're talking about comparison with events like the Great Depression and World War II and things like that. They say viable mitigation options exist on both the supply and demand sides, but to have substantial impact, they must be initiated more than a decade in advance of peaking. Now this, I think, is why the report was buried, why the U.S. Department of Energy disowned the report that they themselves commissioned. Because in effect, the Hirsch report denies the validity of the standard economic argument about peak oil, which is that it's no problem because as oil becomes more scarce, prices go up and create incentives for more discovery, more efficient use of oil, and the creation of alternative kinds of energy sources. Yes, high prices will do all of those things, but the Hirsch team says the price signal will come 10 to 20 years too late to be of much help. Because most of the things, the big structural efforts we can make as societies to adapt, will require lots of money and lots of time. The obvious one is driving more fuel-efficient cars. You know, we have technology right now to have cars that get 60, 80 miles to the gallon of gasoline, what the equivalent in liters is. The technology is not a problem. The problem is that a lot of the car companies like Ford or General Motors have gotten used to building giant vehicles because the prices of gasoline were so low and there was a demand for them. So we don't have millions of small, super fuel-efficient cars coming off the assembly lines. It'll take a retooling of industry for that to happen, and that will take several years. then not everybody buys a new car every year. It takes about 15 years to change out the fleet. So add all that together, that's about a 20-year process to fully implement that strategy. That's only one example. We could look at alternative supplies of biofuels or liquid fuels from coal or natural gas. And so all of the various options were carefully studied by the Hirsch team, and they found that we need 10 to 20 years to prepare. Do we have 10 to 20 years? Probably not. So this is an enormous problem that will affect every aspect of modern societies. Transportation, the airline industry, tourism, food production, distribution of food, manufacturing, plastics, chemicals. Draw your own conclusions. The economic, social, and political consequences will be severe, and there are no easy or quick fixes. So that's the first part of my presentation, and it's time for a little stretch break.
So I'd like to ask you all to stand up, and we'll do a bit of stretching to get a bit of oxygen. So we're going to put our feet hip distance apart. Your left hand on your hip, and breathe in and reach up with your right hand. And across to the left slightly, and then breathing out and down. Other side. Breathing in deeply, stretch across, and drop. Up again, breathing deeply, stretch across, and this time I want to hear a big sigh as you breathe out. Up again on your left-hand side, stretch across, and a big sigh. One more on each side. Up again. Cross to the left, big sigh. One more. Cross to the right, and the biggest sigh yet. Okay. Now we're going to do a swivel of the hips. Further apart. We're going to do soft knees. We don't want to hurt your knees. Don't forget to breathe nice and deep. One more and we'll go back the other way. Now the other way. Last one. And shake it all out of your legs. Now your arms. Shake it all. And your head. Now rub your face vigorously. Now pinch your ears. Get that blood flowing. And last but not least, your eyebrows. Pinch them slowly and firmly. Okay, last thing, rubbing hands together really hard. Feel like heat and energy. Okay, I think we're ready for the next part.
Right, suddenly I feel much more optimistic. Obviously, there are lots of things we can do, should do, and will do in response to the peak oil crisis. I want to talk about one thing that I think would be extraordinarily helpful in coordinating the other kinds of efforts that will have to be undertaken, and that's the oil depletion protocol. Now, this is not my idea. It was originally proposed by Colin Campbell in 1996. And he presented it in 2002 at the first meeting of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. It's been known by different names. I actually published the text of Colin's oil depletion protocol in my book Power Down back in 2004. At the time, I didn't quite understand the wording. I think he he intentionally made a couple of phrases a little bit opaque. And I thought it was a good idea that really didn't have much hope of ever actually being enacted. But then last summer, I spent a couple of days with Colin at his home in Ballydehob, Ireland, and he carefully walked me through the protocol and explained it. And I realized that the protocol is actually ingenious and has a very good chance of being enacted and will help enormously nations, businesses, even the oil industry has something to gain from this. But the text of the protocol is not sufficient unto itself. It requires explanation. And so I have been devoting myself to that task ever since. And I currently have where's the book? Okay, there's the book cover. That's my new book, with the imaginative and sexy title, The Oil Depletion Protocol. Today, by the way, is the official release date. So, happy birthday, new book. Okay, why do we need a protocol? Well, clearly, if we don't have some way of rationing future production on a global basis, we're going to see enormous price swings, we'll see conflict over remaining oil reserves, and nations, businesses will find it very difficult to plan their energy transition. They'll just be responding to crises one after another. At the same time, oil producers will be tempted to overproduce their fields, which of course is the worst thing you can do if you're an oil producer, because that means that you'll damage the fields, and ultimately most of that oil will remain in the ground. This is remarkable stuff. It's amazing that we think of oil as something to use as quickly as possible, when there's only so much of it in the world, and future generations just might think of something neat to do with it. So the general direction we need to go in is pretty clear. We have to find a way to constrain our use of this stuff at a faster rate than depletion. So we have to get out slightly ahead of the decline curve so as to stabilize prices, reduce competition, and preserve some of the resource base. It's simple common sense. And the rate of reduction would be best if it were tied to something objective rather than just a number that we pull out of the hat. I'm happy to say Christine Noem, member of the Australian Senate Green Party from Tasmania, has said this: the overwhelming thing we need is a national plan to deal with oil depletion. I was on the phone with her this afternoon, and she's very interested in the oil depletion protocol, and will be bringing it to the Australian Senate. The other side of the political spectrum, George Pataki, a Republican governor of New York State, is saying foreign oil's undeniable ties to terror, to global instability, and to continued environmental degradation make immediate, decisive action to reduce our petroleum consumption absolutely critical. So he's stumbled across the same idea, evidently. Even George W. Bush saying, we've got to wean ourselves off of petroleum. Okay, so what exactly does the oil depletion protocol say? It says the world and every nation shall aim to reduce oil consumption by at least the world depletion rate. No country shall produce oil above its present depletion rate, and no country shall import oil at above the world depletion rate. So what is this depletion rate? Well, it's simply the annual production as a percentage of what's left to produce. And currently, for the world as a whole, using the best figures we have, which are Campbell's figures, that's about 2.6% per year. Now, of course, one of the possibly slightly covert subtexts of the depletion protocol is that for producing countries to sign on, they would have to first submit to an independent audit of the real reserves. So we would find out what those real numbers are, and it may turn out that the world depletion rate is higher than 2.6% per year. I would be willing to bet it's not any lower than that. But we could start with that figure. Michael Meacher, a member of UK Parliament, says the proposal to cut oil imports to match depletion rate seems to be simple common sense, and I would hardly agree with that. So if we do that, if the nations of the world were to agree to voluntarily, proactively reduce their consumption of oil, how could they get along with less? Well, obviously, and this is not part of the text of the protocol, each nation would have to figure it out for itself, and each nation has different abundance of alternative energy resources, different kinds of transportation systems, and so on. So every country would have to figure it out on its own, but here are some suggestions that I include in the book. Obviously, developing renewable energy sources. That's what we will be depending on by the end of this century. So the idea of making a stepwise change from an infrastructure based on oil to one based on natural gas, and then the natural gas runs out, well, let's go to uranium, and then the uranium runs out, and then we go to coal. And why not just go directly to renewables? Because we have the investment capital now. We may not have it later if we're having to change energy infrastructure every 10 years. We're also going to have to change our agricultural production practices substantially, because currently they're overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. Something like 10 calories of fossil fuel energy have to be invested to produce every single calorie of food energy. That's insanity. And it only works because we have this cheap, abundant supply of practically free energy. We're not going to have that for long, so agriculture is going to have to change. The 20th century was all about moving people off the farms and into the cities, because even if they desperately wanted to farm, they couldn't compete with the large-scale agribusiness farms using huge fuel-fed machines. The 21st century is going to be just the opposite. It's going to be about more labor in food production, not necessarily hordes of agricultural workers out on giant farms, but more about small-scale local production for local consumption. And gardening could play a huge part in that, as it did during World War II, when we had in the US the Victory Garden movement, which produced 40% of the nation's fruits and vegetables from people's front and backyards. Transportation. Well, when many people hear about peak oil, the first thing they think is, well, what the hell are we going to run our cars on, if not gasoline or petrol? Well, that may be the wrong question, because we have to look at transportation in the largest sense. What's the most efficient form of transportation? It's certainly not the automobile. In fact, the automobile turns out to be just about the least efficient form of transportation ever invented. So what are the other options? Well, public transportation, trains, electrified mass transit, and of course, if we have more electrical transportation, then that immediately increases our options, because most renewable energy sources like wind and solar produce electricity. We don't have a lot of electric cars right now. So if we did have more of an electrified transportation system, that would give us more choices, more possibilities. At the far end of the spectrum, of course, walking and bicycle. Bicycle is the most efficient form of transportation ever devised by human beings. So guess what we need less of, and guess what we need more of. We do need to change out the infrastructure. Again, that's going to be a somewhat longer range process, though, especially for American cities like Los Angeles and, well, I hate to pick on Phoenix, Houston, on and on. We can think of many examples. I think Australia probably has an example or two also of cities that don't have robust public transportation systems now. It'll take a while to build them. What do we do in the meantime? We're going to have to use the transportation infrastructure we currently have in a much more efficient way. If you put more people into an automobile, it instantly becomes much more efficient as a means of transportation. So rather than just having cars running around with a driver and 3 or 4 empty seats, we need community cars, we need car co-ops, car sharing, shared taxis, community-supported hitchhiking, These things can help quickly and dramatically. Then how would individuals cope in a situation where the oil depletion protocol was being implemented? How could they make their way in a domestic economy where there was less oil to go around every year? Well, there's going to be rationing, one way or the other, in our future. It's either going to be price rationing or quota rationing. And we found in previous history where we were dealing with essential materials and goods, like food or like energy sources, that where there were absolute shortages, quota rationing was much fairer, worked better. That's why we did it during World War II. Well, David Fleming of Great Britain has come up with an idea for refining the quota rationing systems that most of us are familiar with, at least from history. And that's called the tradable energy quota. And that differs from the old quotas in that during World War II, the quota rations were non-transferable, non-tradable. But what happens if you apply credit card technology and you make them tradable? So everyone would get a certain ration at the beginning of the year, a certain quota of petrol units, let's say, on an equal per capita basis. And then some people maybe would have smaller cars or drive less, or maybe not have a car at all and ride a bicycle or public transportation. They'd have lots of quotas left at the end of the year that they could sell. They would benefit financially. Whereas some other folks might have a big vehicle and they might like to drive it a lot. Maybe they didn't make very good choices about where they were going to live in relation to their work and so on. And they would have to buy some extra quotas as they went along during the year because they wouldn't have enough. So this would be an ongoing transfer of wealth from the energy guzzlers to the energy misers. It would be using the market mechanism to reinforce behavior that would actually be in everyone's best interest. Now, a few questions, objections about the oil depletion protocol. How does it compare with Kyoto Protocol? Well, they're similar yet different. Obviously, both have a lot to do with fossil fuels, but Kyoto is about emissions. It works by first creating something, namely emissions rights, and then rationing those emissions rights, which is not immediately, intuitively obvious kind of thing to do. Whereas the oil depletion protocol is a little bit straightforward. Rather than dealing with what's coming out the tailpipe, it's dealing with what's going into the fuel tank. So that's rationing of that kind is a little more intuitively obvious for the average person to understand. Now, the emissions-based protocols actually offer no direct advantage to individual nations that are adopting them. Think about it. Let's suppose in an alternative universe that Australia were the first nation in the world to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, in this alternate universe, what would Australia get out of it? Nothing much at first, until the rest of the nations of the world signed on, because we just have one global climate. As long as the US and China and Russia and a few other big emitters were not part of the protocol, Australia wouldn't be benefiting very much. It would be getting the emissions of all those other countries. Whereas with the oil depletion protocol, even though it would work best if all the nations of the world were signed on, any individual nation that does so benefits in and of itself. Why? Because it gets to plan its energy transition. It gets some control over the process. And that's why Sweden has decided to become oil-free by 2020 without ever having heard of the oil depletion protocol, as far as I know. But does the oil depletion protocol eliminate the need for emissions-based agreements? Absolutely not. Why? Because if we only have a depletion protocol, then nations will be tempted to make up for declining availability of oil by using more coal and other low-grade fossil fuels, and that will be disaster for the world's climate. So we need protocols to monitor what's coming out the tailpipe and what's going into the fuel tank. How could cheating be prevented? How would it be enforced? This is really not that much of a problem. All global agreements have some kind of secretariat, some kind of enforcement mechanism. This would have to be negotiated, but in principle, it's not a big problem. How can it be adopted? Well, I've already told you about Sweden. Iceland has a similar plan. Cuba is already a relatively small oil consumer, certainly by the standards of its next-door neighbor to the north. But Cuba has pledged to reduce its oil consumption by 2/3. It's declared 2006 the year of the energy revolution. Kuwait, which is, of course, a huge oil producer, is now debating the possibility of voluntarily restricting production. The Kuwaiti Parliament, the members of the Kuwaiti Parliament have heard, have read the articles in Petroleum Intelligence Weekly saying that Kuwait's actual oil reserves are only half of what the country has been publishing. Remember what happened in the early 80s? Well, Kuwait's actual oil reserves are such a tightly controlled state secret that even the members of the Kuwaiti Parliament don't know the real figures. So they want to know. They're asking the question, and they're saying, if this is true, shouldn't we reduce production so that we actually have something left for future generations? Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya made a speech 2 days ago in which he said, oil-producing countries are crazy to be lifting this stuff out of the ground and selling it as fast as they can with economies that are completely dependent on oil exports. What are we going to do when this stuff is gone? We have no other basis for our economies. Declining producers, of which there are many. All of these declining producers are, in effect, already abiding by the protocol, whether they like it or not. They have no choice. Geology is dictating that. And then there are poor nations unable to afford oil at $70. Their imports are declining. Again, whether they like it or not, why not make a virtue out of necessity and thereby bring political pressure on the big users like the United States to cut their consumption? Now what's the likelihood that the U.S. at the national level would actually implement the oil depletion protocol? Probably zero anytime soon. I agree. However, the U.S. happens to be a country that has an enormous grassroots environmental movement. And already we're seeing efforts at the municipal level in cities around the country to assess vulnerability to high oil prices and to plan an energy descent future. San Francisco, California has, and so on, more municipalities outside the U.S., in Canada, in Ireland. In Brisbane, there's just the beginning of an effort at the city council level to discuss oil dependence and how to reduce that. It would be nice to see that happen here in Hobart as well. So this can be implemented not just at the national level, but also by businesses, by cities, by states, and also by individuals. All you have to do is assess how dependent you are on oil right now. How much are you using on an individual basis? And on the oildepletionprotocol.org website, we are developing a calculator, so all you have to do is answer a few simple questions, and you'll find out how much oil you're consuming. And then the calculator will also help you devise a plan to reduce that by 2.6% every year. If lots of individuals do this and publicize their effort via the website, then again that puts pressure on politicians. It says this is a popular idea. We want this to happen. And not only do we want it to happen, we know it can happen because we're already doing it. So the Oil Depletion Protocol project has come into existence just in the last couple of months. I mentioned the website. We have a full-time coordinator. We have some funding from the Wallace Global Fund and a couple of other funders, and we're developing a lobbying effort starting at the grassroots level. We're hoping over the course of the next 2 years to put a copy of the book booklet, a DVD, whatever is most effective in the hands of every significant policymaker in the world. And I think this effort is of considerable significance, because we're at a point in history where we are going to go down one path or the other. Resources, it's not just oil. We're at peak everything, in fact, whether it's fresh water or topsoil, metals, you name it. And down one path is the path of conflict, what I call the last one standing approach, where the coming century will simply be about using as much as we can, as fast as we can before the other person uses it, and devil take the hindmost. And if that's the case, this is going to be the most horrific century in human history. The other possibility is that we find a way to reduce our reliance, especially on non-renewable resources, conserve what there is of everything, and share what's left. I think the oil depletion protocol is a signal effort to move in that second direction, and I will very much welcome your support and your participation in it in whatever way you see fit. Thank you very much.